We are in the decade of the ocean, and by the end of this decade, everybody, all the countries who have signed on to protecting 30% of land and ocean by 2030 should have 30% built in and protected in the ocean. 30% of each of everybody's ocean in the exclusive economic zone should be protected by 2030. That's the way it goes. But are we protecting the right things, and are we protecting for the right things? That's going to be the topic of this conversation. We're going to be talking about marine protected areas for climate change and how that's going to change the way we design MPAs right here and right now. We're going to talk about that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about marine protected areas, one of my favorite topics, a topic that I actually learned about in graduate school. My supervisor had, with a co-author working as a consultant for World Wildlife Fund in Canada, had come up with a way to design marine protected areas, not only for what we call representative areas, but also for distinctive areas. And representative areas are the areas that you would expect to see in a particular habitat, as well as distinctive areas, which is something that was unique. So say like an upwelling or a gyre for example. And then you would see, whales and sea turtles and sharks and things, all these wonderful animals coming in that are highly migratory animals. They come and they gather and aggregate in an area for food, or for maybe it's a unique habitat because it's for spawning, or maybe it's a unique habitat because it's for protection, like a nursery area. All these different habitats need protection. So you have, what you would normally see protected, coral reefs, seagrasses, mangroves, kelp beds, salt marshes, wetlands, and so forth. And then you would also have open ocean areas that had like something unique aspect to it, which would be the distinctive areas. So all these different habitats need protecting, and you need to protect a lot of those habitats so that you have habitat diversity. You're protecting for habitat diversity. Now, in this document that my supervisor actually put together with a co-author, Brian Day. My supervisor was Dr. John Roth. They also mentioned how you had to have different scales of diversity. So there's genetic diversity at the lowest scale. There was ecosystem diversity at the highest scale. And there's obviously middle, like habitat and community and so forth. And then, of course, there's protecting endangered species within that. So there are all these different sort of categories that you have to protect for. It's a huge, project. It's a huge undertaking to take on and say, we need to protect 30% of the ocean. And you just can't go on willy-nilly and say, oh, this looks like a nice area. We know this area is important to a lot of people, so we're going to protect it. Because you may not be protecting the right area, because it might be important culturally, which is great. That's part of the criteria, part of the categories, but it also may not be important in other ways. And where you could be protecting somewhere else, you may not be able to protect all of those in your first area. So you have to really do a deep dive, no pun intended, into the ocean to be able to put all that together. And without that, you don't really have a comprehensive plan. You just have a plan where you're just putting together just different things, it's like piecemeal type of marine protected areas. With all of that, you have the connection of marine protected areas. The ocean is connected biologically and ecologically. That means in the ocean, a lot of animals reproduce where larvae are actually put out into the ocean currents, and then you have different distances that each of these larvae will actually go out and settle. It could be lobsters, crabs, shrimp, fish, a lot of different animals that you're looking at. Plankton can drift as well. And so knowing where the currents go, knowing how far each of these species will go in their larval stages will be a big undertaking as well, and something that needs to be known. And it's something that I looked at doing a PhD in when I was done my master's degree in marine protected area design. I just never wanted to do my PhD for different reasons, more for personal reasons. But that is something that a lot of people look at. Now, you hear me talk about a lot of these different categories. Well, there's an article that came out on phys.org on October 26th. It was by Stanford University, and it's all about designing marine protected areas in the fight against climate change. So here's a new category, kind of new. I mean, we've always known about it, but we've been thinking about how do you design marine protected areas for a specific issue. So this one's climate change. Now, just before we get into the climate change aspect, let's go back into what marine protected areas were designed for in the first place. Actually, let's talk about what it's not designed for in the first place. Because when you look at a marine protected area on land compared to in the water, on land you can actually have physical boundaries where people can't go in to extract or to hunt or to do anything that will disrupt that reserve or that protected area. In the marine world, you don't have physical boundaries. You can't put up physical boundaries, right? You have coordinates, and then you have a boundary that you've put on paper and on a map digitally in a GIS, but you don't have, that idea of, where this starts. Like if you're a fisherman, if you're, a captain of a shipping boat, if you're just a recreational driver, you may or may not know, you should know where you are, but you may or may not know when you've actually entered in the boundaries of the marine protected area. That has to be put out into maps, digital maps, has to be put on nautical charts and so forth, so that people know where they are within the ocean, like in terms of a map. And then, and so it can be difficult to manage, but it's also difficult to protect from certain issues. Right? So anything that flows in and out where you can't control is an issue. So water pollution is a big issue. So it's plastic pollution, that's pollution from development. So if it's along the coastline and there's a lot of, dirt that gets put out into the ocean from, shoreline development or something like that, that will get out and that can get into the marine protected area. That could harm the habitats that you're trying to protect within the marine protected area. And of course, all the different things you are trying to protect, which we'll talk about in just a second, right? Bad water quality in terms of chemical spill, it's really hard to protect against, right? And so there are things that you can protect against, and that's fishing. You can have boundaries set up so that there are no fishing within these boundaries, and so you're monitoring them. It's still hard to enforce because a lot of these marine protected areas are out in the open ocean or far from the coastline. It's really hard to get to, and you'll need something to monitor, whether it be like satellite imagery, whether it be Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard can't be there all the time. So satellite imagery seems to be the tool of the day at this point to be able to ensure that nothing's there. Now, of course, you also have boats that have AIS, which is sort of like a GPS system for boats to find out where shipping boats and other fishing boats go on the ocean, so you can find out where they've been and where you can say where they shouldn't have been. Now, of course, they can turn those off and you don't know where they've been. There's questions to be asked, but you don't know where they've been. So enforcement is a bit of a challenge within that. But you can protect from a couple of different things. You can protect from anything that's extractive that humans do. So oil and gas extraction, mining, deep sea mining, or any kind of ocean bed mining. You can extract from, you can regulate and manage for recreational diving or snorkeling or any kind of recreational fishing or anything like that, whether it's spear fishing or anything. You can regulate for fishing, right? So nothing extractive within that area. So you're protecting for biodiversity. You could be protecting for commercially viable species, fishery species. And those are the two that have been really the focus of marine protected areas when you talk about it. So there are limitations into its protection, but it has been known and documented in a lot of peer-reviewed journals that marine protected areas work when put together properly, as well as when managed properly. So ensuring that no extractive sort of happenings are going on, right? So that's a big thing. So marine protected areas is a tool in the conservation tool belt. It's a significant tool, and it's an area where you can plan the ocean just like we plan on land. When you see things on land, you look at a map of a city or a town, you see that there are plans. There are areas for residential areas, there are areas for commercial areas, there are areas for industrial areas. The commercial and industrial might be the same thing. But there are also areas that are strictly off limits to any kind of development, and they are environmental sort of areas. And these areas are regulated. They can't be touched as long as the government in power doesn't allow them to be touched. And so, you have this ability to sort of plan out the land. Well, marine spatial planning, along with marine protected areas, marine protected areas is part of marine spatial planning, which is essentially a business plan for the ocean for the next 20 to 30 years, and the management adapts as it goes along. So every 5 years, they do a reassessment saying, hey, are these tools working? What are new tools we can bring in to make this management and enforcement better and more efficient? And can we build on that? And that's what you do, right? That's how you manage a protected area. It's not difficult to manage. The challenge is getting the money. The challenge is getting the people and the resources to actually go out and enforce the management of the marine protected area. Now, a number of weeks ago, I talked to the Blue Nature Alliance. We talked about the island of Niue, and we talked about their ocean conservation. It was the OCC, the Ocean Conservation Commitments. And these commitments are somebody can commit or donate or support the marine protected area of a square kilometer within a larger marine protected area. And that what you do there is you support that community, that island, for protecting that piece of ocean for the next 20 years or so. And it wasn't even that expensive. I think it was $148 US. Not bad at all. These are some of the tools that you can do. These are some of the things that you can do to ensure that marine protected areas are put together properly. However, now we've got climate change rearing its ugly head. And climate change is changing everything, right? Climate change is, marine protected areas can't really focus on protecting from climate change, right? These areas can be susceptible to overheating from elevated sea surface temperatures. It could be susceptible to ocean acidification from the lack of carbon dioxide, or the increase of carbon dioxide in the water and the lack of available calcium. So there are a number of different things that sea level rise can affect, like coral reefs and seagrass beds and mangroves to actually be fully functioning and healthy. Sea surface temperatures are affecting kelp and so forth. And so we need to ensure that marine protected areas can protect not only from extractive human processes, but also indirect human consequences from climate change, right? That's where we really need to focus. And that's what this article in phys.org is called Designing Marine Protected Areas in the Fight Against Climate Change. Climate change is one of the hardest things to fight against because it makes everything that we manage worse to manage because the most extremes happen, right? We see droughts, we see flooding, we see bleaching, coral bleaching. We see the degradation of a lot of different habitats just due to the fact that it's affecting other species within the habitats, and those species that normally keep a habitat species healthy, like kelp and stuff, are basically disappearing. And so there's a lot of problems within that. Now, this article, which we're focusing on today, now there's a lot of history to go on marine protected areas, but this article is looking at how does the management and design of marine protected areas change with the fact that we need to account for climate change, which is already difficult because climate change does not see any marine protected area boundaries, right? Whereas fishing, you can stop fishing within the boundaries of marine protected area so that the animals, the species that are being fished can actually recoup, they can grow in abundance, and then they can spill over into outside of the marine protected area, giving fishing communities the ability to fish even more and even longer and more sustainably, right? Without touching within the border of the marine protected area. Great, that's wonderful. With climate change, however, climate change doesn't see the boundaries. You can't say within these boundaries, climate change, you're not allowed to affect anything within these boundaries. So this piece of water within these boundaries, is going to stay cool. We're not going to see increased CO2 come in here. You can't say that, right? You can't say, I'm being sarcastic. You can't say that. That will never happen. So we need to focus more on what is going to happen. And we need to say, hey, let's try and protect the inevitable. Let's try and protect the areas that will be the most resilient towards climate change, right? Before, with marine protected areas, sort of the traditional way of doing a marine protected area, and that's evolved over the last 20 or 30 years, and actually even longer, maybe even 50 years. The marine protected area design and implementation has changed quite a bit. It's not just pulling out what people think are important pieces of water. It's pulling out what is fitting within the biodiversity criteria, the different scales I talked, the genetics, the species, the habitat, and the ecosystem diversity, right? So we need to make sure that all the genetics of a species because there could be different genetic makeups of a species, are protected. Then we got to make sure that the species, if they have different populations of a species, those are protected. Then we're looking at the habitats, which involves community of species, and habitats is could be like one particular habitat, coral reef, seagrass bed, kelp forest, whatever that might be, right? Salt marshes, wetlands, that kind of stuff. Even like oyster beds could be a habitat as well. So anything that will bring in a diversity of animals, you want to make sure you get a diversity of those habitats and a diversity of each set of habitat so that you can protect everything. Then you have the ecosystem. So now the ecosystem is made up of a number of different habitats. So you want to make sure you have a lot of different habitats. You have a lot of different species. You have a lot of different communities. You have a lot of different genetic diversity, all in one. Do they fit that criteria? That's the traditional way of doing things. Then you just hope for the best. We've seen, and it's been proven that when managed properly and enforced properly, marine protected areas can protect many of those guidelines, right? And many of those kind of criteria that we're looking to protect, if not all, depending on, the marine protected area, depending on the country, and depending on the department or the community who is looking after these protected areas. Now, of course, a lot of that, comes with stakeholder engagement and making sure that all the ocean users are on board so that the marine protected area can be not only enforced by the government, but also enforced, and many of the times enforced by the community members who are using that area and want to use it for future decades to come. Now, when we look at climate change, how do we protect all of these marine protected areas from climate change, right? Or any future protected areas from climate change? And this is where it gets interesting, because in this article, it talks about one particular case study, which is the Southern California Bight. Now, the authors used 21 biological and physical guidelines presented in their framework to map out protections for giant kelp ecosystems and species across the Southern California Bight. The vast region is distinguished by a gradual bend in the southerly trajectory of California's coastline when it curves to the southeast along the peninsula of the Baja California, Mexico. Here, we have giant kelp forests provide nursery areas, shelter from predators and storms, and food for hundreds of commercially and culturally viable species. In recent years, marine heat waves and prolonged periods of low dissolved oxygen have led to the collapse of commercially viable fisheries like jumbo squid and abalone, jeopardizing the livelihoods of local communities. So they went and looked at all this, and they said through Baja California, though Baja California is home to large marine protected areas, and in the progress of designing more, less than 1% of the coastal waters are fully protected and prohibit extractive activities like fishing or drilling. In California, marine protected areas comprise of 16% of state waters, half of which are fully protected. So that means basically 8% are fully protected. According to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, these protected areas make up the largest ecologically connected marine protected area network in the world. But however, the network doesn't account for how species move across the U.S.-Mexico border, which means even if one country is protecting the species nurseries, so those benefits are lost in protection if protection ends in a short drift into the neighboring country where larvae might settle and grow into adults. So if you think about it, you have a nursery area, right? And then you have areas where all these larvae come to settle. So if that area where the larvae are actually, released, from the parents, if that's not protected, then you're not going to have any larvae that's released. You may protect the sink where it all ends up, but not the source where it starts. And so not protecting that, if it's over the border even, not protecting it within the borders of a country is difficult, but it makes sense. But not protecting it across the international border from Mexico to US could be costly, because you could be taking away the source of one sink, and that's not good, right? So if it starts off in the US and it ends up and the animal ends up in Mexico, but if in US they're not protecting it properly, then you're taking away the sink, and vice versa, right? If Mexico's not protecting the sink properly, where all the larvae settle, then there's really no point in protecting the source. So they're talking about, when you design marine protected areas, you start to account for international borders, because larval distribution does not account for international borders. And that's a big part in designing proper marine networks of marine protected areas, is to make sure that each protected area has a source and has a sink. So it has an area where all these larvae are coming from, and then, depending on the species, that sink will change in the distance from the source, right? So you could have a shrimp species that only settles maybe 20 kilometers downstream, or you can have a crab species that settles 100 kilometers downstream. So you're going to have to know which animals settle what distance and where those will end up, or the probability of where those will end up, based on doing modeling. So a lot of different things to account for, right? It's not an easy process, and that's why it takes so long when you design these sort of marine protected areas, or any marine protected area. Now, when you have climate change, so we're looking at accounting for connection, we're looking at accounting for doing managing these marine protected area over the border. Now you have to also worry about what's going to survive climate change. What habitats have the best chance of surviving climate change? That's going to require more research into these habitats. So you can take what's been put out there now. So we all know that California has a network of marine protected areas. The state it has about 8% of state waters are fully protected, and 16% of state waters are about half, right? So now we're looking at designing marine protected areas, or really focusing on protected areas that will survive sea surface temperature rise, that will survive ocean acidification, that will survive sea level rise. And you have to look at how each of the habitats and species and communities within each of these areas will be best, right? And which ones should we really focus on in the future as designing marine protected areas? And there may be parts where the current marine protected area system may not be suffice in protecting against climate change. Then we might need to look outside of that network of MPAs to find out which actually is the best one to protect. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done. But here's an example, right? If you're having trouble understanding, if you have a kelp habitat that is degrading because of high sea surface temperature and low oxygen levels, like we talked about earlier in this discussion, you may have areas that come in and on a regular basis bring in upwelled water, bring in water from the bottom of the ocean, or towards the bottom of the ocean, or below where you are. It's nice cold and fresh and salty water, or cold and a little less salty, but cold ocean water that brings up the water. When it comes up, it comes over that habitat and it cools down the hot sea surface temperature that it's seeing and having to deal with. On a regular basis, it does this. Not only does it cool it down, but the rush of water brings in more oxygen for the habitat. So it can help the species out, right? It can help in maybe a little bit of photosynthesis and so forth, in the byproducts, but you need more oxygen, you need cooler waters. So areas that have that influx of cooler waters with high oxygen levels or higher oxygen levels will be better off than areas that don't have regularly cool water flushing through the area naturally. So identifying these areas along the California coast, along the California southern bight, will be important in the future of this marine protected area to say, you know what, if we can find all the other criteria within this area, we know that it's in a prime area to do well against climate change, and it'll be another category that we fit within the larger network of marine protected areas. So in case climate change does a doozy on, like just it did this summer, but does it a couple summers in a row. It does a doozy on a couple of the marine protected areas that we designed in the traditional way. But when we look at the marine protected area that was designed for climate change, now we're saying, oh, you know what? The water's still coming through. It looks good. All the species are there. They look happy. They look abundant. We've succeeded after however many years we implemented it. So 4 or 5, whatever that might be. Good. Now we are starting to create marine protected areas for climate change. It's not going to be easy. We may not always be right. But the fact that people are calling it out and saying, hey, this is what we need to do. This is where we need to shift our priority based on this past summer when we saw so many droughts. We saw so many floods. It was ridiculous, especially off the coast of California. They had a lot of rain and flooding within the spring, and then a lot of drought and wildfires within the summer and fall. That is scary. So, we look at how our infrastructure does during these times, when fires are destroying buildings and areas and residences and so forth, right? And then you have, you have flooding in certain areas that are taking away all of that. Imagine the number it's doing underwater, which is harder to recoup. It takes time to recoup a city after being, part of it's being, flooded and destroyed or burnt by fire. But we can put money into rebuilding those buildings, rebuilding those houses, or providing some sort of temporary housing for the people that are there. But when we discover that things are happening badly underneath the ocean surface, okay, now it's harder to rebuild. Now it's making it difficult. So by being proactive and identifying the areas that will do better under climate change and protecting those areas from other things such as extractive uses, so fishing, mining, oil and gas drilling, those types of sort of issues or those types of challenges that happen or activities that happen need to be completely restricted within those areas, or partially. I prefer completely, but some might be partially. But unless it's a true marine protected area, there are no extractive actions that can happen or activities that can happen within there. And that's what we have to move through. That's how we protect for climate change. We start looking at the areas that will do better during the climate change consequences that we see in the ocean. Right? I already mentioned it a number of times. We're looking at sea level rise. We're looking at ocean acidification, and we're looking at increased sea surface temperature. And that's the big part of the picture for the future of marine protected areas within this decade. Now, it's great that we discovered it now within this decade because it's the decade of the ocean. There's a real push to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. So the fact that we are going to be putting together marine protected areas that are good for climate change or that can resist and have a higher resilience with climate change, rearing its ugly head, we'll be in a better place, right? We just got to focus and be proactive in protecting these areas instead of trying to play catch up with climate change and being reactive. That means governments have to set aside money to be able to design these marine protected areas. These are not cheap. They take a lot of person power, and that's something that we really need to focus on in the future. And the good news is marine protected areas has evolved. We know they work, and we know they're good for the environment when they're done properly and when they're designated properly. So now it's just a matter of taking that process and looking at different criteria, saying let's protect for also climate change. Let's also protect for climate change. So that's the episode. That's what I had to say. That's what this article essentially has to say. I'm going to put a link to the article on phys.org. You can check it out. This was a Stanford publication, I believe, with a number of different authors involved. And so, that's something that is very important. We thank them for doing this. And thank you to phys.org for posting this. So I'm going to put the link so you can read it on phys.org. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. You can DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. You can also email me if you go to speakupforblue.com/contact, and that goes straight to my email, my work email, my Speak Up for Blue email. And then you can also just, if you want, leave a voice message so I can hear your voice. You can do so on the webpage. Just go in the bottom right-hand corner. There's a microphone there. All you have to do is just click on it, and then you can you can just press start recording, and you can leave your message on my page, I guess is what it is, and I can listen to it, and I get to hear your voice, and I will respond to it either within an episode or through email or however. Okay? Maybe even with a video or so. But anyway, I know I go long on these with marine protected areas, but this is something that I think is very important. It's the decade of the ocean. We need to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030 in each country. And so this is a big focus, and we're already at the end of 2023. So we really need to step it up. And this is one way we can step it up and do it faster and really hit those targets of protecting the right protected areas. They're expensive. They take a long time to protect, so you want to make sure you do it right when you do it. But anyway, that's the episode for today. If you think someone that you know would benefit from learning about marine protected areas, please feel free to share this episode. It's free. Just go to your favorite podcast app, click the episode, and just click probably it's like 3 dots or something that's on the side, and just say copy link and send it to your social media network, your family, your friends, anybody who you think, and colleagues, anybody who you think would benefit from listening to this episode. I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.